When the shot cracked through the Harlem night, it wasn't just a gun firing, it was a code being broken. The sound echoed off brownstone walls and storefront gates, sharp and final, slicing through 135th Street like a verdict. Men froze mid-step. A woman screamed from an upstairs window. Somewhere, a radio kept playing jazz, oblivious to the fact that Harlem had just crossed a line it never meant to touch. The bodyguard lowered the smoking pistol slowly, his hand steady, his eyes locked forward. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. He stood there beneath the street lamp, coat collar turned up, knowing every rule he had just shattered, and exactly why he had done it. Across the street, a man lay crumpled on the pavement, blood spreading into the gutter like spilled ink. He was one of their own, and that was the problem. In Harlem, loyalty was law, silence was survival, and bodyguards, especially his bodyguards, did not fire without permission. Everyone knew whose protection he was under. Everyone knew what that meant. And within minutes, word began to move the way it always did, fast, low, and unstoppable, through barbershops, numbers houses, churches, and back rooms. A shot had been fired in Harlem, not by the police, not by the Italians, but by a man sworn to protect the most disciplined, most calculating, most respected power broker north of Central Park. By the time Bumpy Johnson heard about it, the night had already changed its direction. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson did not rise from his chair when the messenger finished speaking. He sat in the back room of his favorite restaurant, the air thick with cigar smoke and fried onions, a glass of cognac untouched in his hand. The men around the table waited, watching his face for a crack, a twitch, anything. None came. Bumpy Johnson had built his power on control, not chaos, not impulse. Control was what separated him from the hotheads buried in unmarked graves and the loudmouths rotting upstate. Control was why Harlem moved when he spoke and paused when he went quiet. A bodyguard firing without orders wasn't just a mistake, it was a threat to the entire structure. "Where?" Bumpy finally asked, his voice low, measured. 135th and Lenox, the man said. "Crowd already gone. Police on the way." Bumpy nodded once. No anger, no shock, just calculation. That intersection sat at the heart of his territory, where the businesses paid on time, where the community felt protected, where trouble knew better than to linger. For blood to be spilled there without his consent meant something had gone wrong long before the trigger was pulled. He stood, straightening his coat, every movement deliberate. "Bring him," Bumpy said, "before the police do." To understand why that shot mattered, you had to understand the world it disrupted. Harlem in those days was a city within a city, vibrant, proud, suffocating under the weight of outside authority and internal survival. The police came north only when they wanted to remind people who carried the badges. The politicians showed up during election season, shook hands, made promises, and disappeared. The Italian mobs controlled downtown, but Harlem belonged to its own codes, its own enforcers. And at the center of it all sat Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. His reputation did the talking, earned over decades of calculated alliances, disciplined violence, and an almost surgical understanding of power. He paid his people. He protected his streets. He punished betrayal with precision, not spectacle. Men followed him because he kept order, and bodyguards were the spine of that order. They were not thugs, they were professionals, chosen for restraint as much as loyalty, trained to absorb disrespect, to deflect confrontation, to protect the man behind them without becoming the story themselves. Which is why what happened on Lenox Avenue shook Harlem to its foundations. The man who pulled the trigger, Isaiah Ike Turner, wasn't reckless. He wasn't new. He had stood behind Bumpy Johnson through police raids, mob negotiations, and nights when tension sat so thick in the room it felt like breath might set it off. Ike knew the rules. He enforced them. Until that night. The man he shot wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a rival gangster or a crooked cop. He was a messenger, a collector, A man who had quietly decided the rules no longer applied to him. And when Ike Turner broke the code, it wasn't out of anger, it was out of warning. By the time Bumpy arrived near the scene, the police had cordoned off the block. Squad cars flashed red and blue against Harlem brick, officers standing stiff, hands resting just a little too close to their holsters. They knew this wasn't a random shooting. Harlem didn't do random. A captain spotted Bumpy stepping from the car and stiffened. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," he said, voice tight. Bumpy met his eyes calmly. "Captain?" No titles, no pleasantries. Both men understood the boundaries. "This doesn't concern you," the captain said, more statement than request. Bumpy smiled faintly. "Everything north of 110 concerns me." The captain hesitated. That pause, barely a second, told Bumpy everything. The police didn't fully understand what had happened yet, and that gave him time. Time to get ahead of the narrative, because if the streets decided that one of his men could fire without consequence, Harlem would spiral. Rivals would test him. The Italians would sniff weakness. The police would press harder. Order had to be restored. And that meant facing the man who had fired the shot, and the reason he'd felt forced to do it. As Bumpy turned back toward his car, the weight of the night pressed in. This wasn't just about discipline. This was about whether the code that held Harlem together still meant something. And before dawn, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson would decide whether that shot was an act of betrayal or the beginning of something far more dangerous, something that would force even him to choose between order and truth. Isaiah Ike Turner sat alone in the back of the car, wrists loose, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The city rolled past the window in streaks of shadow and streetlight, but his mind stayed on Lenox Avenue, on the sound of the shot, on the way the man's body fell, on the silence that followed. He hadn't planned it. That truth mattered more than any excuse. Ike had lived by Bumpy Johnson's rules for nearly 8 years. He had learned when to speak and when to disappear, when to stand tall and when to melt into the wall behind the man he was paid to protect. He had swallowed insults from cops and mobsters alike, knowing that restraint was part of the job, knowing that survival depended on patience. But the man on Lenox hadn't just crossed a line. He had spit on it. The story, as it began to circulate, was simple on the surface. The dead man, Calvin Morris, had been collecting for an operation that operated under Bumpy's protection. Numbers money. Clean, predictable, essential to the neighborhood's quiet economy. Morris had always been reliable, always polite, always on time. Until recently. Over the past few weeks, whispers had started to follow him. Small things at first, payments arriving light, excuses offered too quickly, eyes that didn't meet yours when questions were asked. In Harlem, those signs were never ignored. They meant pressure, or greed, or outside influence. Ike had noticed. He had reported it. And the answer had been the same one Bumpy always gave when evidence wasn't solid. Watch. Wait. Don't move without certainty. So Ike watched. That night on Lenox, Morris had approached him differently, too close, too confident. His voice was low, his smile thin. "You work for a smart man," Morris had said. "But smart men don't always see what's right in front of them." Ike told him to step back. Morris didn't. Instead, he leaned in, breath heavy with liquor and arrogance. "Things are changing," he whispered. "Money's moving. People are choosing sides. You should think about where you stand when the dust settles." That was when Ike saw it. The outline beneath Morris's coat. The stiff way his right arm hung. The look of a man who believed he was protected by more than reputation. Morris wasn't just skimming. He was positioning himself. And he wasn't alone. Ike gave one final warning, a quiet one, a professional one. Morris laughed. The gun came up fast after that. Too fast. Ike didn't remember deciding. He remembered reacting. One shot. Center mass. No theatrics. The code was broken the moment Morris reached for his weapon. The problem was, no one else had seen that part. When Ike was brought into the room, Bumpy Johnson was already seated at the head of the table. No guards flanking him, No weapon visible, just presence. The kind that made men straighten their backs without realizing why. Ike stopped 3 steps in and waited. Bumpy studied him for a long moment, eyes calm, unreadable. "You fired without orders," Bumpy said at last. "Yes, sir." "On my street?" "Yes, sir." "You know what that means?" Ike nodded. "Yes, sir." Silence settled heavy between them. The men along the walls didn't move. They had seen Bumpy mete out judgment before, swift, exacting, final. They knew this wasn't a conversation meant for comfort. "Tell me why," Bumpy said. Ike lifted his eyes, not defiant, not pleading, just honest. "He was armed," Ike said, "and he was making moves." "That's not proof," Bumpy replied evenly. "No, sir," Ike said, "but it was warning." Bumpy leaned back slightly. "You're telling me you decided to interpret warning as permission?" "I'm telling you," Ike said carefully, "that if I hadn't fired, he would have, and not at me." That landed differently. Bumpy's fingers tapped once against the table. "Explain." Ike laid it out. The missing money, the conversations, the threat, the gun. "He wasn't just stealing," Ike said. "He was testing, seeing who'd blink first. He thought having a piece made him untouchable." "And you proved him wrong," Bumpy said. "Yes, sir." The room waited. Bumpy Johnson had built his reign on patience, on seeing 10 moves ahead, on punishing disobedience because it threatened stability. If his men decided they could make judgment calls involving bullets, the entire structure collapsed. But if Morris had been planning something bigger, Bumpy stood. That alone tightened every chest in the room. "You understand," Bumpy said, stepping closer, "that even if you were right, you've put me in a position." "I do," Ike said, "and I'll take whatever comes with that." Bumpy studied him again, longer this time. "You ever hear a man talk too much when he thinks he's already won?" Bumpy asked quietly. "Yes, sir." "Morris been doing that?" "Yes, sir." That was the crack. Bumpy turned to one of his lieutenants. "Find out where Morris's money's been going. Everyone he talked to in the last month. Everyone who suddenly thinks they're bigger than they were." Then he looked back at Ike. "If you're lying," Bumpy said calmly, "you won't hear the shot that ends you." Ike nodded. "I wouldn't expect to." By sunrise, the truth began to surface. Accounts that didn't add up. Names that shouldn't have been connected suddenly appearing together. A quiet Italian intermediary sniffing around Harlem business that had never been open to outsiders. Morris hadn't just been skimming, he had been selling access. The shot on Lenox hadn't started a war, it had stopped one. But stopping it came at a cost. Because now, Bumpy Johnson had to decide how to explain to Harlem, and to his enemies, that a rule had been broken, and why the man who broke it might still be standing. And that decision would force him into a confrontation far larger than one body on the pavement. A confrontation with authority, loyalty, and the very code that kept Harlem from tearing itself apart. By mid-morning, Harlem was awake and restless. News didn't travel fast there. It traveled deep. Every storefront conversation carried the same undercurrent. A man close to Bumpy Johnson had fired a gun without permission. A collector had died in the open, and the police, unusually quiet, hadn't rushed to point fingers. That silence was dangerous, because silence created space for interpretation, and interpretation, in Harlem, often led to action. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. He stood at the window of his office, watching the street below like a general surveying a battlefield that pretended to be calm. Men moved slower than usual. Heads turned more often. Respect was still there, but so was uncertainty. Order could not survive uncertainty for long. Behind him, his lieutenants waited. Each one represented a different piece of Harlem's machinery: numbers, protection, logistics, diplomacy. None of them spoke until Bumpy did. "Who's asking questions?" Bumpy said without turning. "Everybody who shouldn't be," one man answered, "and a few who think they should." Bumpy nodded. That matched his expectations. The Italians would already be testing lines, quietly, politely, the way men did when they wanted plausible deniability. The police would be deciding whether this was an opportunity or a trap. And within Harlem itself, smaller operators would be wondering if the code was still ironclad, or if cracks had formed. Bumpy turned from the window. "Call a meeting," he said. "Tonight, the ones who matter." One of the men hesitated. "About the shooting?" "About the rules," Bumpy replied. The shooting was just the question. The antagonist didn't arrive with a gun, he arrived with paperwork. Captain William Donnelly had been in Harlem long enough to understand what power looked like there, even if he refused to respect it. He wore his authority the way some men wore armor, thick, visible, and meant to intimidate. He requested the meeting under the pretense of clarification. Bumpy allowed it because refusing would have sent the wrong message. The room they met in was neutral ground, an old community hall that had seen rallies, funerals, and more than a few closed-door negotiations. The chairs were set simply, no spectacle, just presence. Donnelly arrived with 2 detectives and a folder tucked under his arm. "Mr. Johnson," he said, not offering his hand. "Captain," Bumpy replied, taking his seat. Donnelly opened the folder slowly. "One of your men shot another man in cold blood, in public." Bumpy's eyes didn't move. "That's your version. That's the only version that matters to the law." A murmur rippled through the room. Bumpy raised a finger, and silence returned instantly. "You want to arrest him," Bumpy said calmly. "I want to make an example," Donnelly said, "because Harlem's been getting ideas." Bumpy smiled faintly. "Harlem's always had ideas. You just don't like not being invited." Donnelly's jaw tightened. "Your bodyguard broke the law." "He prevented a crime," Bumpy replied. "One you didn't know about." Donnelly leaned forward. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you," Bumpy said, voice steady, "to understand that if Morris had succeeded, you'd be dealing with something far messier than one dead man." Donnelly laughed. "You don't get to decide that." "No," Bumpy said, "but I do get to decide how much order you deal with." That landed. Donnelly closed the folder. "You're protecting him." "I'm protecting Harlem," Bumpy said, "from men who think selling it piece by piece won't have consequences." "And who protects it from you?" Donnelly shot back. Bumpy held his gaze. "You try. And you've been failing for years." The room went quiet. Donnelly stood. "This isn't over." Bumpy nodded. "It never is." That night, the meeting Bumpy had called filled the hall. Numbers runners, business owners, community leaders, men who rarely sat in the same room unless something serious demanded it. They came not out of fear, but out of respect. Bumpy stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back. "You all heard what happened," he began, "and you all heard the rumors." He let that sit. "A rule was broken," he continued. "That cannot be ignored." Murmurs rippled again. "But understand this," Bumpy said, voice firm. "The rule exists to protect the community, not to shield betrayal." He laid out the truth. Not every detail, but enough. The missing money, the outside interests, the gun. Morris hadn't been punished for disrespect. He had been stopped for endangering everyone. "And the man who stopped him," Bumpy said, "did so knowing the price." He gestured, and Ike Turner was brought forward. Ike stood straight, eyes forward. "This man will not hide behind me," Bumpy said. "He will answer for what he did." A pause. "But he will not be sacrificed to make outsiders comfortable." That was the line. The room understood. Discipline would be enforced, but not at the cost of truth. Authority would be respected, but not blindly. "You want order," Bumpy concluded. "Then remember why the rules exist, and remember who enforces them." When the meeting ended, Harlem exhaled. The code hadn't collapsed. It had evolved. But evolution invites resistance. Because Captain Donnelly wasn't done, and the Italians, now aware they'd nearly gained a foothold, weren't done either. The shot on Lenox had stopped one betrayal, but it had exposed how close Harlem had come to losing control of its own fate. The real confrontation was still coming, and when it arrived, it would test whether Bumpy Johnson's power came from fear or from something far more dangerous: legitimacy. Captain Donnelly chose his moment carefully. He didn't strike in the heat of outrage or under the pressure of headlines. He waited until Harlem thought the storm had passed, until routines resumed, payments flowed, and the streets settled back into their familiar rhythm. Then he moved. The arrests came just after dawn. Not for Ike Turner, not yet. Instead, Donnelly ordered coordinated raids on 3 number houses, 2 social clubs, and 1 business that sat squarely under Bumpy Johnson's protection. No warrants served with ceremony, no explanations offered beyond clipped phrases and hard stares. It was a message: you don't get to set the terms. Bumpy Johnson heard about the first raid while finishing breakfast. By the third, he was already on his feet, coat in hand. This wasn't law enforcement. It was leverage. The confrontation took place at the precinct, not in an interrogation room, but in Donnelly's office. Walls lined with commendations, photographs of politicians shaking hands, reminders of a system that believed itself permanent. Bumpy was escorted in without cuffs, a courtesy earned through years of uneasy coexistence. Donnelly didn't offer a seat. "You think last night settled something," Donnelly said. "I think it clarified things," Bumpy replied. Donnelly stepped closer. "Your man killed someone. I can make that stick." "You can try," Bumpy said calmly. "I don't need to win in court," Donnelly snapped. "I just need to make life difficult." Bumpy nodded. "That's usually how this goes." Donnelly slammed a hand on the desk. "You don't get to decide justice in this city." Bumpy met his gaze. "Neither do you. Not alone." That stopped him. Donnelly straightened, smoothing his jacket. "Here's what's going to happen. You give me Turner. Publicly. Quietly. I charge him. The raids stop." "And if I don't?" Bumpy asked. Donnelly smiled thinly. "Then Harlem learns how fragile its peace really is." Bumpy considered him. This was the heart of it. Not the shooting, not Ike Turner. This was about who controlled consequence. "You want a body," Bumpy said. "So the system looks strong." "I want the message clear," Donnelly replied. "No one's above the law." Bumpy leaned in just enough to make Donnelly uncomfortable. "Then stop pretending this is about the law." Silence hung heavy. Donnelly exhaled slowly. "You're running out of options." Bumpy stepped back. "No, you are." That night, Harlem felt the pressure. Businesses closed early. Patrol cars lingered longer than usual. Men who had walked freely for years now checked corners twice. The raids had done their job, not by dismantling operations, but by reminding everyone who carried badges. And still, Ike Turner remained untouched. Hidden, but not hidden away, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't protecting a man, he was protecting a principle. The breaking point came 2 days later. Donnelly arrested Ike in broad daylight, no warrant shown, no resistance offered. Ike didn't fight because he knew fighting would cheapen everything that came after. The image traveled fast, photographs in the papers, headlines framing the narrative Donnelly wanted. Bumpy Johnson's enforcer arrested in cold-blooded killing. It was an invitation to the Italians, to the politicians, to anyone who wanted to test Harlem's backbone. And Bumpy Johnson accepted it. The courtroom was packed, not with spectators looking for blood, but with eyes measuring power. Community leaders sat stiffly beside reporters. Police officers lined the walls. Donnelly took his seat with the confidence of a man who believed momentum was on his side. Bumpy entered last. He took his place behind his lawyers, unarmed, unflinching. When Ike was brought in, their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. The prosecution painted a simple picture: a violent enforcer, a public shooting, a city terrorized by lawlessness. Donnelly watched from his seat, satisfied. Then the defense began to peel it apart. Witnesses testified to Morris's behavior. Financial records were introduced, carefully, legally, showing missing funds and unexplained connections. A clerk from a downtown office admitted under oath to being approached by Morris with offers of partnership. The gun, the threat, the warning. One piece at a time, the narrative shifted. The turning point came when a police report, filed weeks before the shooting, surfaced. A complaint about Morris carrying a concealed weapon. Ignored. Unfollowed. Donnelly stiffened. The judge leaned forward. "Captain," the judge said slowly, "was your department aware of this individual prior to the incident?" Donnelly hesitated. That was all it took. When the ruling came, it was restrained, but devastating. Charges dismissed, not because the court endorsed violence, but because it recognized self-defense and negligence. Ike Turner walked free, not celebrated, not paraded, simply returned. Outside, Harlem waited. When Ike stepped into the sunlight, there was no cheering, no shouting, just nods, respect. The police presence receded slowly. The Italians pulled back their feelers. The message had been delivered without a single threat spoken aloud. Bumpy Johnson stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over his territory. He hadn't won by force. He had won by making the system confront its own blind spots. Later that evening, Bumpy called Ike into the same room where judgment had first been passed. "You broke the rule," Bumpy said. "Yes, sir. And you saved this neighborhood from something worse." Ike didn't respond. "That doesn't make what you did right," Bumpy continued, "but it makes it necessary." He paused. "You don't fire again without my word." "Never," Ike said. Bumpy nodded. "Then we're done here." As Ike left, the weight lifted. The code hadn't been broken. It had been tested and proven flexible enough to survive. But legends aren't made in courtrooms. They're made in what people remember afterward. And Harlem would remember this moment, not as the night a man fired a shot, but as the moment Bumpy Johnson showed that power didn't need chaos to defend itself. The aftermath didn't arrive with applause. It came quietly, through behavior. Harlem adjusted the way a seasoned fighter shifts their stance after taking a punch. Not rattled, not broken, just more aware. Businesses reopened without hesitation. Numbers runners moved with confidence again. The streets resumed their rhythm, not faster, not louder, but steadier. The kind of steadiness that came from knowing where the lines truly were. Captain Donnelly kept his word. The raids stopped. Not because he wanted them to, but because continuing would have required admitting defeat. And men like Donnelly didn't survive long in uniform by doing that publicly. Instead, he retreated into procedure, paperwork, transfers, quiet reassignment requests that would eventually move him south of Harlem's invisible border. The war he had hoped to provoke never materialized, because Bumpy Johnson hadn't given him the villain he needed. Inside Harlem, the consequences were more personal. Bumpy called a final meeting, not of power brokers, but of his inner circle. No speeches, no posturing, just accountability. "The rule stands," Bumpy said. "No one fires without permission." Eyes met his. No one challenged it. "But hear this," he continued. "If you see betrayal, you bring it to me early. You don't wait for it to grow teeth." That was the adjustment. The code hadn't softened. It had sharpened. Men left that room knowing the balance had shifted slightly, but significantly. Loyalty wasn't just about obedience anymore. It was about vigilance. And that change would ripple through Harlem for years. Ike Turner didn't return to his old position immediately. That was part of the price. Bumpy reassigned him, not as punishment, but as insulation. Less visible, less symbolic. Protection didn't always mean proximity. Ike accepted it without complaint. He understood something most men never did. Survival inside a legend required humility. Still, word traveled. Not about the court victory, about the restraint. Men spoke in barbershops and back rooms about how Bumpy could have burned the city down, and didn't. How he could have sacrificed one man to quiet the noise, and refused. That kind of power unsettled people. especially rivals. Downtown, the Italians took notice. They had misread the situation. They thought Morris's play had exposed weakness. They thought chaos was close enough to touch. Instead, they found a structure that corrected itself without collapsing. That made Bumpy Johnson more dangerous, not less. Future negotiations changed tone. Respect replaced assumption. Harlem was no longer seen as an opportunity, it was recognized as a boundary. And boundaries, once respected, tend to hold. The community felt it too. Church leaders spoke of safety without fear. Business owners invested without bracing for fallout. Mothers walked their children past Lenox Avenue without quickening their steps. Not because violence had disappeared, but because it had been contained. Justice in Harlem wasn't blind. It was deliberate. Years later, men would still talk about the shot on Lenox. But they wouldn't argue about who fired it. They argued about why it mattered. Some said it was the night a bodyguard crossed the line. Others said it was the night Harlem avoided becoming a battleground. Both were right. Because the truth lived in the tension between them. Bumpy Johnson never corrected the story. He didn't need to. Legends don't survive by controlling narratives. They survive by leaving evidence. And the evidence was clear. After that night, no one tested the code lightly. Collectors stayed clean. Outsiders stayed cautious. Authority approached with calculation instead of arrogance. Respect had been reinforced, not demanded. The final consequence wasn't fear, it was clarity. Everyone understood where power came from and where it ended. And that understanding preserved something fragile in Harlem: balance. Time has a way of stripping moments down to their truth. Years after the shot on Lenox Avenue, long after Captain Donnelly's name faded from precinct rosters, and Calvin Morris became just another cautionary tale, Harlem still remembered what that night meant. Not because it was violent, but because it wasn't allowed to become chaos. That distinction mattered. In a neighborhood where history had taught people that authority often arrived with a boot and left with a bill, Bumpy Johnson represented something complicated, unofficial, unsanctioned, but deeply understood. He was not a hero in the clean sense. He was a custodian of balance in a place where imbalance always invited exploitation. And the Lenox Avenue incident became the moment that balance was publicly tested and held. Bumpy's reputation after that night changed in subtle but lasting ways. Before, he was feared for his reach, respected for his discipline, acknowledged for his intelligence. After Lenox, he was seen as something rarer, a man who could absorb pressure without cracking, who could bend rules without breaking the structure they upheld. Men learned that proximity to Bumpy didn't grant immunity, it demanded responsibility. That lesson traveled faster than any threat ever could. Ike Turner, for his part, never spoke publicly about what happened. When asked, years later, he offered only one sentence: "I did my job. The rest wasn't for me to explain." That restraint preserved his place in the story. He eventually returned to Bumpy's side, not as prominently, not as symbolically, but as proof that loyalty, when paired with accountability, could survive even the hardest scrutiny. The police adjusted too, not in ways they'd admit. Harlem saw fewer theatrical raids, more paperwork, more quiet negotiations. Authority learned that confrontation for its own sake cost more than it gained. They still enforced the law, but they stopped trying to provoke spectacle, because spectacle, they learned, was something Bumpy Johnson could turn against them without ever raising his voice. For the community, the legacy was personal. People remembered how close things had come to unraveling, how easily one bad decision, one unchecked betrayal, could have invited an outside war into their streets. And they remembered how it didn't happen, how order was restored without mass arrests, without random bloodshed, without humiliation. That memory became a form of armor. Historians would later debate the morality of men like Bumpy Johnson. They always do. They would argue about legality, about power outside institutions, about the cost of order enforced by unofficial hands. But those arguments rarely included the voices of the people who lived there. The shop owners who kept their doors open, the families who slept through the night, the neighborhood that remained intact when it could have fractured. For them, the legacy was simpler. It worked. The shot on Lenox Avenue didn't elevate Bumpy Johnson because it showed his strength. It elevated him because it revealed his restraint. Anyone could have turned that moment into an excuse for violence. Anyone could have burned the city to prove a point. Bumpy Johnson chose something harder. He chose discipline under pressure. And that choice echoed. As Harlem moved forward, through changing laws, shifting politics, and inevitable decline, the principles reinforced that night endured longer than most regimes ever do. Respect mattered. Betrayal had consequences. Authority was negotiable, but dignity was not. Those ideas didn't belong to Bumpy alone. They belonged to Harlem. That is why, when people spoke of him years later, they didn't always mention his wealth or his connections. They talked about moments, about the times when everything could have gone wrong and didn't. And Lenox Avenue was always one of them. The shot on Lenox Avenue was never about the gun. That's the part people misunderstood when they tried to reduce the story to headlines and court transcripts. Guns were common in Harlem then. Violence wasn't unusual. What made that night endure wasn't the sound, it was the restraint that followed it. Because real power doesn't reveal itself when a trigger is pulled. It reveals itself in what happens next. Bumpy Johnson could have erased a man to quiet the noise. He could have unleashed fear to remind everyone who stood at the top. History had given him every excuse to do exactly that. Instead, he chose something rarer. He chose to let truth surface, even when it complicated his authority. He chose discipline over ego, structure over impulse. He chose Harlem over spectacle. And in doing so, he reminded everyone, police, rivals, and his own people, that respect isn't enforced by chaos. It's earned by consistency. That night wasn't just about a bodyguard who broke the code. It was about a leader who proved the code was bigger than any one man. Harlem didn't remember Lenox Avenue as the night violence won. It remembered it as the night dignity held its ground. And that is why Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was never just feared. He was trusted. In a world where authority so often confused power with domination, Bumpy Johnson showed something different, something harder. That sometimes the most legendary response isn't pulling the trigger, it's knowing exactly when not to. And that lesson, long after the echoes faded from Lenox Avenue, remained one Harlem never forgot.